Welcome to the Philly Prime Podcast and Mob Talk Sit-Down. Joining me today, George Anastasia. And George, we're getting together today because we had an interesting court ruling this week in Toms River, Ocean County, about the number 3 guy in the Lucchese Crime Family, Martin Taccetta, who's been in jail for a long time and is trying to get a new trial. This is a pretty good W for the Taccetta group.
Yeah, it's a 30-year-old case. They've been fighting this off and on for all that period of time, and it looks like they're at least going to get an evidentiary hearing, and that's the first step toward getting a new trial. Or, in the alternative, the judge just saying, no, forget about it, he goes free. I mean, that's another option, I think.
Yeah, well, let's background this out if we can. This is a case that went before a jury in 1993. Taccetta was acquitted of a murder, convicted of racketeering conspiracy, and some other charges. Some of the other defendants were convicted of the murder. One other was not as well. There was a whole bunch of here, there, and everywhere. And Taccetta ended up with a life sentence, 30 years without parole, which is what he's serving now. And he's at the point now, I think he's about 3 years away from the potential for parole.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the other option. Like, there's so many different moving parts in this kind of thing. And the fundamental question the defense is raising, and it's a fascinating question, is was there a conspiracy by law enforcement to rig this case? And they're hooking it on these dental records that might have provided an alibi for Martin Taccetta on the day of the murder, June the 12th, 1984, I think it was. He claims he was at the dentist, and so he couldn't have been involved in the murder.
Right,
so,
there are the dental records that they showed in court. Yep.
And the state, Bob Carroll, who was the prosecutor, sent these records down to the FBI lab in Washington to have them analyzed, and the analysis said that one of the dates on the dental record had been altered, and it was reading 8/12 and August 12th, when in fact it was originally 6/12. Somebody fiddled with that and changed the 6 to an 8, and as a result, it undermined Taccetta's alibi. This record doesn't show you were there, and again, it's very, very convoluted as to who did what and when. And it all goes to an overriding allegation from the defense that this was all part of a conspiracy by law enforcement to bring Taccetta and his brother and Tumac Asatura and all those guys to justice, because they had all laughingly walked away from a big racketeering case in Newark a few years earlier. It goes back to that.
Yeah, that's a federal case, correct? And that kind of stuck in their craw pretty good.
Yeah, and the defense is arguing this is kind of a revenge prosecution, and they played fast and loose with the rules because they were so hell-bent on getting a conviction. I don't know. We're looking at 30-year-old history. It's difficult to assess all of this, but it is a fascinating case.
Right, and the further point here is that when the records were sent down to the FBI, the defense is alleging that that's as the trial is about to start in 1993. They're claiming they didn't know they were sent down there. B, they're claiming once the FBI lab down there made a ruling that they believe, the defense believes, that ruling was communicated to Bob Carroll or somebody in the Attorney General's office, and that they sent 2 investigators personally down to the FBI lab to retrieve the FBI report saying the dental records had been altered, which would back up Taccetta's claim that he was, in fact, at the dentist an hour away when Cooperators was killed. Right. So therein lies the problem. The question is that true or is it not true? And the judge here, Judge Vicari in this case, basically said the evidentiary hearing is limited in scope to the FBI lab report, and I'm reading from her ruling, a 19-page ruling, questions of whether it was suppressed, meaning not turned over to the defense, and whether it is material so as to warrant a consideration for a new trial. That's the 2 elements here. Was it suppressed, and is it material, meaning would it have affected the trial to the point where he was convicted, and does he deserve a new trial?
Yeah, and that's the other interesting kind of prong on all of this. Was it material? The state has argued, listen, Martin Taccetta was found not guilty of that murder by the jury, so this doesn't really matter. But the defense is saying it matters. One, if it was suppressed, it indicates a conspiracy to rig this case. 2, it's material in that both key prosecution witnesses, Phil Leonetti and
DiArco.
Marco, the acting boss of the Lucchese family, claimed that Martin Taccetta was involved in the murder. And this alibi would have undermined their testimony. And the defense is saying it might have undermined all the charges in the case, because if they're unbelievable in that, maybe they're unbelievable with everything they said, there's no way to determine how this might have impacted the jury. That's the material question. And that, at the end of the day, I think that's probably more important than the suppression.
Yeah,
So,
that's the false in one, false in all.
Right.
If you put before a jury, and you and I have seen this in countless mob cases, that either a witness lied, a government informant, a cooperator, and you can't believe that witness, and the fact that the prosecution put him up there and he lied, would say that what else would they do? And even though they've made the claim about the murder case that he was found not guilty of murder, their contention is, had we been able to flesh this out in court and show that these records were altered and an FBI report backs that up, what else was done to this case? That's the big what else question with a question mark.
Right. That's goes to the suppression thing. The material issue is, all right, if Leonetti and DiArco are claiming that Taccetta committed this murder, and evidence here shows he couldn't have possibly done it, what else are they lying about? And I mean, you go to the credibility of those two witnesses, and that goes to the broader racketeering charge and everything else that the other defendants and Martin Taccetta were found guilty of. So it's fundamentally, it's an attack on the entire prosecution. Whether it's going to hold, the other thing is just logistically, Dave. I mean, this guy's been in jail for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is the state going to want to go through a whole process of retrying a case when this guy's in his 70s now and he's done 30 years? Do you really want to risk all of that again? Or are you just going to say enough's enough, and fold your tent? It depends. If the judge rules that there should be a new trial, I think then the prosecution has got to decide, well, do we really want a new trial, or we're just going to say, game's over, we won, we're going to walk away? That's another potential development here. We're not going to try him again.
And can you do it? Like you just said, it's a 30-year-old case. Can you reassemble all the witnesses? You're going to bring Leonetti and DiArco back in. Can you get all these other documents and things like that? The other witnesses involved here, and with a evidentiary hearing here, you're liable to get Bob Carroll as a witness here.
Yeah, but I mean, if were to go back to a retrial, both Asatoro and Riccardi cooperated after they got convicted, became cooperating informants. Are you going to bring them in? What are they going to say? Because apparently, and it's such a convoluted case. Apparently, according to the defense, at least in Riccardi's case, there have been multiple affidavits where he said one thing and then another. Where's the truth? So, it's revisiting a 30-year-old case. It's the Lucchese. This Lucchese crew is legendary. So from that perspective, it's really interesting. But in terms of the legal process, is it really worth revisiting all of that? From our perspective as reporters and writers who are interested in this area, sure, it's fascinating. But does the prosecution want to spend the time and energy maybe to get egg on their face, or are they just going to say enough's enough?
So I think there's
my gut feeling tells me if she rules that there should be a new trial, I think the prosecution is going to ultimately decide, no, never mind, we'll let it go and let him go free. That's what I think is going to happen.
And even before we get to that, you have a situation here, and I mentioned it a second ago. Bob Carroll is currently the Morris County prosecutor. I work with him in the Attorney General's office. He's a very good lawyer, a very good prosecutor. Clearly, he was appointed to be the Morris County prosecutor later on in his years here, and he's still the prosecutor up there. So, do you want to bring Bob Carroll down to Ocean County, to Tom's River, put him on the witness stand and have him be cross-examination by Marco LaRocca, who's a very good attorney, who's representing Taccetta? Do you want to put him through all that? Do you want to walk through that entire situation? I think you come to that question first. Not saying that Bob Carroll couldn't stand up to any kind of withering cross-examination he might get from Marco LaRocca. Basically what I'm saying is, but do you want to put the guy through that for what, a 2.5 or 3 years, whatever's left on Martin Taccetta's hearing? Or do you fold the tent before you even get to the evidentiary hearing? I got a sneaky feeling that's going to get some strong consideration. Step one.
You might be right about that. And again, Tassetta's already done almost 30 years, and he's in his 70s. You could very easily come to a conclusion. Enough's enough. He's paid a price. Let's walk away from this. We'll see. I mean, I've always been amazed at that particular group in North Jersey, that Lucchese organization, the crew. I remember DiArco. I wasn't there for the whole trial, but I was in and out of Tom's River a couple of times. And I remember DiArco testifying about, and he said it's a saga. And he talked about how the New York guys wanted to just wipe out this whole crew because they were a crime family within a crime family,
right.
And they played by their own set of rules. Asatura was down in Florida wheeling and dealing and running the family remotely. And the two Tassettas were, I think they had a cafe or club called the Hole in the Wall. They were everyday guys out on the streets. And it was, you lose sight of the bottom line in all of this is the guy got killed.
Mm-hmm.
Vinnie Craparata, Jimmy Sinatra.
Right.
He got bludgeoned to death with golf clubs, and apparently was part of an extortion attempt. His nephews were running a video poker machine, and they were paying tribute, and it was a dispute of who they're going to pay tribute to, the Lucchese's or the Philadelphia branch of.
Yeah, that's the Philadelphia angle, which is why we're talking about this. The
Right.
Philadelphia mob was in a at loggerheads with them over who controls that, who gets the money from that kind of thing. That's what
Right.
initially piqued our interest in this case.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons Leonetti was called as a witness, because who was getting the tribute payment. And we're talking 1993, originally 1984 when this happened, so almost 40 years ago. The tribute payment was $1,000 a month. Doesn't sound like a lot now.
No.
Back then it probably was somewhat significant. It was a cash flow, a stream of money. So anyway, Craparata's nephews. Now, the other thing that somebody else claimed is they weren't really balking. All they were saying is who we got to pay.
Yeah.
So why was Craparata killed? There's a lot of different elements in this thing, a lot of different moving parts.
Let me ask you about Phil Leonetti. We all know he's quietly kind of faded off into the sunset here. He made an appearance on Patrick Bet-David's entertainment podcast a while back, 2 years ago. I think something maybe a little bit longer. It got multi-million views on his channel, that kind of thing. Would Phil Leonetti want to come back to a new trial and get up there and testify again? I got a feeling he's probably not going to want to do that.
I agree with you. These guys, I mean, they've done their duty, so to speak. I think that's their attitude. We did what we said we were going to do, and I don't want to be bothered anymore. I don't know how difficult it would be for them, one, to find Leonetti. He's in WITSEC. I don't know that the feds would give up where he is and if they can get access to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the same thing applies to DiArco. They're going to bring him back. And after 30 years, as your story, you run the risk of you testify, and then do you remember exactly what you said back then? If you offer any kind of conflicting testimony, the defense is going to jump all over it.
Yeah.
And
those two witnesses, their testimony basically was that Taccetta himself told them he was involved in that murder. And that's what is in dispute with those two on the witness stand. And that's Marco LaRocca's argument is we can use this report that they monkeyed with this. And I think the 302s are in somewhat of discrepancy. The FBI 302 reports that someone's confession before they get on the witness stand. And then they confront them with those questions, those kind of things. But it looks like right here, as far as the evidentiary hearing, the judge is keeping this on the FBI report, whether it was suppressed and whether it's material enough, meaning has enough meaning to impact having a new trial.
Exactly. It was material enough to warrant that the jury might have come back with a different verdict if this information had been available. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
The other thing that's the fundamental issue here that gets raised, and we don't talk about this enough probably. Law enforcement, they don't always play by the rules either. I mean, sometimes guys play fast and loose, and that's been an argument in this case from the get-go. And this goes to the heart of that. If a dental record was doctored to undermine Tassetta's alibi, what does that say about the whole investigation? I mean, that's where the defense is going with this.
Oh, yeah, that's at the heart of their argument here. If that would happen, don't say just because he got found not guilty of the murder that it doesn't matter. It does matter. The question before a jury would be if this was done and then a report that would have backed up our alibi was suppressed and not given to us and we didn't see it. And by the way, Runke and Michael Critchley, the two lawyers who handled this case originally, have given affidavits to the court saying they never saw
Right.
The FBI report. They were never told about the FBI report. A third attorney has now also weighed in and said the same thing, who represented Ryan in the case.
Right.
The exact same thing. So you have three very prominent attorneys who have said they knew nothing about this, and had they known at the time, they would have used this to attack the prosecution's case.
Yeah, I mean, you can almost hear Runke or Critchley in their closing argument using that and saying, look, if they lied about this, if they did this, if they doctored this piece of evidence, what else did they do? You just lay that and to put that seed in the juror's head.
Yeah.
And they're arguing we might have got everybody acquitted had we been able to do that.
Yeah. And George, you and I have been around enough courtrooms and enough mob trials and things like that, that those little tiny things that you don't think the jury's that tuned into, if there's members of the jury who are not buying the government's case and they just need a little shove over the edge, that kind of thing, as small as it may appear in a closing argument, could mean a lot to one or two jurors. And then you got a hung jury, potentially a mistrial, or they start swinging them back the other way and win the rest of the jury over, and you get an acquittal on the whole thing.
Yeah. And you know, again, we're looking back 30 years, but this jury appeared to be hardworking in terms of what they did, because they didn't find Martin Taccetta guilty of murder. They didn't find Ryan guilty of murder. They did find Riccardi. So there were three people charged with the murder. Only one guilty verdict came back on the murder charge. So they were making distinctions back there as they deliberated based on what they heard and what the evidence was.
Yeah.
This kind of evidence might have pushed others in the other direction. You're right. So,
and the state actually argued that in their response to Marco LaRocca's request for a new an evidentiary hearing and a new trial. And the judge kind of said, you know, the jury took their time here. They parsed through all this and they made independent decisions on each of the defendants in this case. So they did give it a good look and they did study it. The question is, had they been able to study this issue, that there was a report backing up him, does that all the question marks start flying around the screen? You know what I mean?
That's the heart of this thing.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder, and again, we're 30 years after the fact, if any of those jurors are still around, if anybody's tried to talk to any of them and ask them what if kind of thing. You know?
Yeah. George, let me ask you about the 30-year sentence that Martin Taccetta got in this case.
Yeah.
Acquitted of the murder, racketeering, conspiracy. I think there's some extortion stuff, things like that, theft by extortion, you know, that kind of stuff. Isn't that, I mean, if you look at the scheme of things these days, I mean, we're talking about back in 1993 in the early 90s, whatever, 30 years seems like an awful long time for that without a murder.
Yeah. And I think what the state argued was, this is a career criminal. This guy's, you know, and they laid out his rap sheet, if you will. He's always been involved. This is just the latest example. And they used that as leverage to get him hammered. And to me, it was kind of excessive. When he beat the murder rap, I think, and he probably thought, racketeering, you're looking at 10 to 20 maybe. But he's 30 plus 10, no parole for 30. I mean, that's what he got. Life, I think it was life plus 10, no parole until 30 years.
Yeah.
It's a very, very harsh sentence. Yeah, absolutely. For somebody who beat a murder rap in this case.
Yeah.
You know, it's
and as you said earlier, and I kind of agree with this, I mean, if you look at the factor of what it would cost to put on a new trial like this, going back and getting the witnesses, potentially putting a prosecutor on the stand, potentially having to bring back government witnesses and things like that. I think if you get out the scales of justice here and weigh it left and right here a little bit, if you're the Attorney General's office, you might come to the conclusion of, we're going to do all this over 2.5 or 3 years left on a sentence before he could be paroled. Probably a good time to like zip up the tent and close it down.
I think so. I mean, I think one way or the other, I think that's what's going to happen. I don't think we're going to see a new trial. If she rules in favor of the defense and says there should be a new trial, then I think the next thing happens and the state decides no. And maybe, as you discussed, maybe even before we get to the evidentiary hearing, they're going to fall for 10.
Yeah. George, let's go hypothetical here. Let's say he either gets a new trial, potentially gets acquitted. They decide we're going to fold the tent and let him out. What becomes of Martin Taccetta at the age of 72, having been in prison for the last 26 and a half years on and off.
Well,
where are they in the Lucchese scheme of things
well,
up in North Jersey?
That's what I was just going to say. If we were talking about Philadelphia, somebody coming back to the Philadelphia mob, you and I would probably have better insight into what the lay of the land was. I don't really know what the situation is up there. I know that that particular crew is active, has always been active. I mean, at one point, Nicky Scarfo Jr. was part of that with the Perners. That's the other thing. This is a crew that guys grew up together. They're related, blood relatives, related through marriage. It's a family within a family on a lot of different levels. I don't know what the lay of the land is up there right now. I mean, he certainly would have weight in the underworld, given that he did all this time. But where does he fit into the scheme of things? Does he want to fit into the scheme of things? You know, some people say, you know, they talk about the Sopranos being based on the Cavalcanti crime family. Other people think, no, it was really based on this Lucchese faction of the Jersey branch of the Lucchese family, and that Martin Taccetta was a prototype for Tony Soprano. I mean, maybe a little bit of a stretch, but if you look at the events that were transpiring around this particular crew and look at some of the storylines in the Sopranos, it makes a lot of sense to me. These guys were, in a lot of ways, they were roguish, they were funny. Don't get me wrong, though. There was a violent streak in all of this, and Craparata was the guy who paid the price for it.
Yeah. The only thing I can kind of liken this to is the Scarfo guys coming home in Philadelphia. You had Fafi Iannarella come home on the street now. You had Joseph Chicky Cianglini, who came back. And unfortunately recently passed away. A very nice gentleman. I had an opportunity to meet him once or twice after he got out of prison. A number of other guys, Phil Narducci out of prison, Joe Pungator out of prison, several others out of prison. That's the only thing I could liken it to. They did 26 to almost 30 years each. Where does that kind of sit you when you come back? Obviously, you get the respect of having been the number 3 guy in the mob in the Lucchese Crime Family, and you get the respect of being a stand-up guy and doing your sentence and fighting to the end here to get out and get what you perceive to be justice. You kind of get that tip of the hat coming out of the prison gate.
I think absolutely you get that. The question is, does anybody put money in an envelope and hand it to you and say, relax, take it easy, or here's a no-show job, just enjoy the rest of your life? As I said, I don't know enough about the lay of the land up there to figure out where and what will happen. But I think in many ways he'll be taken care of.
Yeah. And then the other question becomes, does the Lucchese Crime Family in New York, which has its own set of problems up there currently, do they respect any of what's gone on here in Jersey? And do they still respect Martin Taccetta and the Tacettas and Assator and those guys in the same way they did back in those days? Does that rise to the same level? Do they even fit into the plan, so to speak?
Well, I mean, you know, 20 years, 30 years later, a lot of the guys that were around back then are not even around. And the Lucchese's have certainly had their problems. And as I mentioned, Assator and McCarty became cooperators here. Gaspipe Casso was a notorious boss up there, but also an alleged cooperator. So they're not going to be able to throw stones. Here's a guy who did his time, kept his mouth shut. That carries weight with everybody.
George, can we shift gears for a second and do a little local something? We had a interesting exit from prison last week. Salvatore Sonny Mazzone, the brother of former Philadelphia mob underboss Steve Mazzone, left prison. He was at Fort Dix for about 13 or 14 months. He went to FCI Schuylkill and was released from there last week. Sonny is a very affable guy, very well respected. They call him Sonny Boy sometimes on the street. Your thoughts about him being the first defendant in that 2020 racketeering indictment to see the prison gate and come home?
Well, not surprising given the sentence that he was given. But the other thing that underlines is this case, there was a lot of hoopla around this case. But at the end of the day, I don't think it was really that significant. A couple guys got hammered. Stevie got hammered, and Dominic Grandi got hammered, and Joey Electric. But a lot of the guys, you know, it was a lot of sound and fury, signifying not that much in terms of an attack on the Philadelphia crime family. And Sonny Mazzone will be out back on the streets doing his legitimate stuff and become part of the South Philly storyline again. I think a lot of these guys, I mean, you mentioned earlier Phil Narducci. A lot of these guys have had enough with this. They realize the risk involved, and they can find a way to make money without becoming part of a criminal enterprise. And the other thing with Philadelphia, we've said this again and again and again. Somebody's always wired up. Somebody's always taping what you're, making a recording. Why do you want to do that kind of crap?
Yeah.
So, and here's the third thing. You got a mob boss or an alleged mob boss who's doing a podcast now. What does that tell you? Where the hell are we? So there's a lot of different elements in play right now.
Yeah. And I got to be honest with you, this case you talked about, for all the wind and hoopla and headlines about it, some of it made by us when it first came out. The end results were Dominic Randy got the biggest sentence, 6 to 7 years. Steve Mazzone got 4 to 5 years. Sonny Mazzone got 2 years. He's already out. He's in a halfway house for the next 6 months, I think till May sometime. Joe Servideo got 12 years plus because of a drug involvement in that. Salvatore Piccolo got a bunch of years. He's not out till 28 or 2028 or 2029, that kind of thing. You didn't get the bang for the buck that you got here in the Merlino case, where some people went away for 9, 10, 12, 13 years, and there were no murder convictions in that case. This case didn't have any murders. It basically was plead guilty to a racketeering conspiracy case, and pretty much that's what they all did. Dominic had some drug charges in there.
Yeah, and here's the other question in that case. Where is Anthony Persiano?
Yeah, what happened to him?
Yeah.
What's his sentence?
I don't think he's been sentenced yet. Every once in a while I go on Pacer and look. Not sentenced yet. And, he's the construction expediter, estimator. Supposedly he's out in the middle of America somewhere doing the same thing again.
Yeah.
This is a guy, again, we're talking Philadelphia now, so we're talking about our own backyard. This is a family that's been decimated by electronic surveillance. And Persiano was the second Philadelphia member to record his own making ceremony. Talk about an embarrassment. So that undermined in a lot of ways this case, and I think the government tried to make this case bigger than it was. They weren't able to take it to the next level. You know what they always hope. You bring pressure, you're going to get somebody to flip, and then you go up the next, get somebody to talk about murders, because there's 6 or 7 unsolved murders sitting out there, but nothing's happening with them. And this was not a case that brought enough pressure to get anybody to flip.
Yeah, George, tell me if you agree with this. People keep asking me about this almost every day, and with Joey Merlino being on a podcast every week and talking about the Philly mob, talking about his life, talking about all the other things. The question I keep getting is there even a Philadelphia mob? Is he even the boss anymore? Let's leave that to the side. Is there even a Philadelphia mob, or has the mob gone into its shell here? Because these guys are in their 60s now. They all did significant jail time, the Merlino crew, and they don't want to go back to jail. And they know as well as you and I know. We had John Taggart from the crime scene unit on talking about mob murders a while back, saying if we had the technology we have today, back then, those murders would have been solved. They know there's cameras everywhere. They know there's a potential wire everywhere. They know there's a potential cooperator there. Do they want to roll the dice anymore to be called the Philadelphia mob and to act like they're still the Philadelphia mob of the old days? Do they want to roll that dice and potentially go back to prison? I don't think they want to. I think it's your famous line, make money, not headlines. And that's the new mantra or motto, if you ask me, for the Philadelphia mob guys. And they're all trying to go legit and involved in legitimate operations. Can't say what else they're doing, but at least on the face of it, that's what they're doing.
No, I think that's an accurate assessment of where things stand. I think a lot of these guys still like the veneer of I'm a wise guy, or I was a wise guy, or I'm part of this thing. But in terms of what they're actually doing, it's legitimate, quasi-legitimate. And I think a lot of these guys have done significant jail time, and another significant sentence is life for some of these guys. In their 60s now, 60s, yeah. 70s. So, yeah, there's a lot at stake. You don't see the level of violence we used to see. That's by the boards, and here we are. I mean, I think there's always going to be a Philadelphia crime family, but it's a shell of what it used to be. and
Yeah.
I don't think it'll ever be what it was.
Yeah. Listen, let me say this about Sonny Mazzone. I always had a personable relationship with the guy. Always very cordial, very respectful. Bump into him in South Philadelphia here, there. His crew and his family's been through a lot in the last few years between the indictments and other family matters and things like that. And I'm sure they're very happy to have him home. I, for one, kind of glad he's back out on the street. Was this worth all that to put him in jail for 14 or 15 months? I think if I had to reconsider that, I'd say no.
No, probably not. And the other thing I think that the Philadelphia family has going for it is they're not a priority anymore. In terms of the FBI, it's not a priority. They got other more important things to look at. So if these guys stay under the radar, keep a low profile, and concentrate on making money and not busting heads, they're probably going to have a decent run going forward.
George, does this go from this thing of ours to this thing of mine for them individually? I got to take care of myself. I got to make my own income. I got to do my own legit thing because I can't count on the mob anymore to be passing the envelope, giving contributions, kicking up, street tax, that kind of thing. Is it now this thing of mine individually?
I think that's part of it. I think that's a generational thing as well. It used to be a way of life. Now it's a way to make money. So, how do you make the best of that kind of situation? I think that's where we are. And it's, there are other organized crime groups that are probably more violent and are out on the streets now doing things that are more detrimental to society. And that's where government is focused.
Okay. Let's finish up with one thing on the Taccetta case. I talked to Marco LaRocca. I've looked at the court documents. I spoke with the court. It looks like there's going to be a hearing on this, evidentiary hearing on February 13th. It's going to start early in the morning. It's a Tuesday at, I think, 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm also told this could go multiple days. That's 2, 3, possible 4. George, we talked about the mechanics of putting this all back together. That hearing alone could potentially go multiple days.
Yeah, and the thing to watch for that hearing is the witness list. Who is going to call whom to testify about what? We'll know that as it moves forward, but that's the thing to watch right now.
Yeah. Fascinating case, George, and I hate this pun, but this was a good kind of case to sink your teeth in if you get it with the dental records there, but which is what our headline will be on this week. But certainly worth keeping an eye on. We'll keep you updated on things like that. George, as always, I appreciate you coming on, talking about this. You're my partner. I appreciate that. And everybody from mobtalksitdown.com and the Philly Prime podcast, appreciate you listening this week. And stay tuned. We'll have more on this coming up.
Absolutely. We're not going to let this go away.
All right. Thanks, George. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Have a good one.